Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate the context which Carmel Sepuloni has given on this bill, both as our social development spokesperson, but also as a member of the Select Committee. But I think, she's rightfully acknowledged a number of really important people, and not least those who are raising children in these circumstances. But I think we should also acknowledge the fact that this bill has come to the House, acknowledge groups like UNICEF, CPAG, the Children's Commission, because they have changed the environment in which we are considering child poverty issues. But, Mr. Chair, that leads me to then look at the context of this bill and ask, in part one, are we addressing what has been identified as the key issue around child hardship? Because it is, of course, called the Children in Hardship Bill, and it's called that for a very specific reason. I just want to talk about that a little bit. There are 305,000 children in poverty based on an income measure, but that is not who this bill targets. And we can see that by looking at part one of the bill and the clause 3, the Principal Act, which it states, this part amends the Social Security Act 1964. We are only here amending the Social Security Act rather than amending broader tax credit legislation, for instance, which may affect a wider bracket of children. So the 305,000 children we know who are in income poverty, we know that there are 2 out of 5 of those children whose family are in paid work. So they are not necessarily solely dependent on the Social Security Act. We know also that some of those children, however, will be, and they might be picked up. But in fact, this bill, if I recall correctly, targets roughly, 10,000 children of a much broader bracket of children. Well, looking at some of the regulatory impact statements to try and get a sense of why was it then, if based on the Children's Commission, we know that there are, and this is incorrect now, it's higher, 305 in income poverty, where in this definition was this bill targeted? Well, the government was quite clear that they wanted to target material deprivation, and that's what's then translated into hardship. Material deprivation, roughly in New Zealand, about 180,000 of those children, and those children are ones who, based on a scorecard, are determined to have a certain number of forced lacks, things that families cannot afford to purchase in order to make sure that their lives reach a certain standard of living. So that's where the government said they wanted to hone in. How then did we end up with just amending the Social Security Act in order to target material hardship? Well, we can see a little bit as to why that is in the regulatory impact statement. One of the first bullet points in the regulatory impact statement states, the fiscal envelope available for the package that this bill is set around amending Social Security was based on ministerial consideration of New Zealand's current fiscal position and other competing priorities. The government indicated scalable options should be developed within a fiscal range for the package of up to $1 billion over 4 years, $250 million per year. Because the government's overall objective was to take more immediate action to reduce material hardship among children, ministers signalled an interest in options that would be relatively quickly improve material resources available to family through the package. So we've got 2 indications there. They want it to be quick, and they wanted it to be within a limited fiscal package. Now that's important because this bill, in part one, we could have been debating, instead of an amendment to the Social Security Act, we could have been debating an amendment to the Working for Families framework. We could have been actually debating here tax legislation instead of benefit legislation. And why weren't we? Well, when Brian Perry came to Select Committee at his last appearance, I asked that question. Why, Mr. Perry, did the government not amend the family tax credit instead of the Social Security Act? Because as this House will well know, the family tax credit goes both to beneficiaries, which sits counter to the minister's claim that this is the first time there's been an increase in income for beneficiaries. Working for Families did that too. It went both to beneficiaries and to low-income families. So it wouldn't have just targeted the material hardship kids, it would have targeted the income poverty kids as well. Now that's an important difference to point out as we debate part one of this bill, because it is still of a grave disappointment to me that we are just debating the Social Security Act instead of tax legislation. Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second reason why it's a disappointment that we've narrowed the frame to the Social Security Act is because Jonathan Boston had done a considerable amount of analysis about what it would take not just to increase the incomes of families in hardship, but to lift them over the poverty line. Now, the Minister knows, as well as Labor knows, how difficult it is to do that. And the reason we know that is because we did the analysis ourselves when we looked at the Best Start package. Boosting a family, not just up, but out of poverty, means getting them out of that 60% median income threshold. Or maybe if you're going to be a little tighter, because we know that there's two measures. Here, the 305 are in, at 60% of the median income or less. But those at the hardest end of poverty, they're in 50% of the median income or less. Now, lifting those kids out, as Jonathan Boston modelled, would take a lot more than what this amendment to the Social Security Act in Part 1 does. Because we're looking at, up to 20, really, reality, not much more than $20, right? Whereas Jonathan Boston's modelling, it's more like 60, if you actually want to make a significant difference, and per child. Important point here, this is not a per child payment that we are debating in Part 1. We are debating a family, per family payment. So we know that what we're amending, the amendment to the Principal Act around the Social Security Act is not substantive in that regard and won't make necessarily the difference to children in hardship that this bill purports to make. But yes, we're also equally worried, as my colleague has pointed out, around some of the Part 1 changes in definition, because whilst the government was chucking out this carrot, they obviously decided they needed a stick. I find that really disappointing because overwhelmingly this change was welcome. That stick was not only entirely unnecessary, but actually to the detriment of the families the government was trying to help. And we see that in clause 4, the change of definition to the word part-time work up to 20 hours. And in combination of that, we've also seen a change in the definition of when a family would be work tested. At the moment, it's 5 because we make an assumption that state provision of schooling kicks in at that point. They've dropped it down to 3. Now, one assumes that makes an assumption around the provision of early childhood education. But we cannot assume access to early childhood education in great parts of New Zealand. In fact, in South Auckland, analysis has been done around the gaps in early childhood education. Now, one simple way that this side of the House and my colleagues, Porter Williams and Kamal Sepuloni, who put to its elite committee, was creating a carve-out to say, if you cannot access early childhood education, these clauses should not apply to you. Those tests, as set out in clause 4, should not apply to you. Because simply the assumption is that you are freed up from carer duties if you are able to have a 3-year-old in free ECE. Now that is problematic if that ECE is not available. Now surely that's a fair and reasonable clause to put in here. And we've tried this in past welfare bills. We've tried to say, create a few exemptions, give the discretion just in case. Now the other point that I think is really important to make is that, of course, this bill is somewhat naive to the nature of part-time work. Let's be honest about where part-time work exists. Part-time work exists in retail, hospitality, service, call centres, things that operate outside what one would refer to standard school hours. And yet, we've seen before the way work and income operates is if work is available and they consider it to be fair and reasonable, you have to take it or your benefits cut. Even if it is totally inappropriate when stood up alongside the availability of ECE hours, another flaw in the bill. In fact, the regulatory impact statement even acknowledges that actually work itself, which the government is driving as being the sole answer to child poverty, that actually you can still exist in poverty even when you are trying to couple together work. I want to read out in the regulatory impact statement. A key driver for child poverty of households with adults on lower wages is too few paid employment hours. They acknowledge there is not enough paid employment hours, and yet we're about to penalise people who can't find ghost jobs. It is absolutely outrageous that as unemployment grows, we are putting in place penalties for the most vulnerable people. Minister, you could have given this carrot without the stick and we would have applauded that.